Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to find your child standing by your bed, whispering something that makes your blood run cold. This isn't just a nightmare, it happened to me. And what my son said that night changed everything. Watch till the end to find out the chilling truth. It was one of those nights where everything felt still, too still. The kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, like the world is holding its breath. The house was wrapped in darkness, the only sound the slow, rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. I was exhausted from a long day, finally sinking into the comfort of my bed. Sleep came easily, pulling me into a deep, dreamless rest. Then, something changed. I didn't wake up to a sound. There was no creaking door, no footsteps. It wasn't the kind of disturbance you hear. It was something else, a presence, a feeling that crept over my skin like cold fingertips tracing my spine. My eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim glow of the nightlight near the door. At first, everything seemed normal. The familiar outlines of furniture stood motionless in the dark, but then I saw him, my son. He stood by my bedside motionless, his small frame barely illuminated by the soft light. His face was pale, his expression blank. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at me. A wave of confusion washed over me, followed by something else, something colder. My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat. "Hey, buddy," I whispered, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the sleep. "What's wrong?" He didn't answer, he didn't blink. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to pound. "Did you have a bad dream?" Finally he moved. A small shake of his head. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Dad, there's someone in my room." The words sent a chill through me, slicing through the last remnants of sleep. I stared at him, waiting for him to say more, hoping, praying that this was just a dream, talking, just a child's imagination running wild. But he wasn't trembling. He wasn't rubbing his eyes or looking confused the way kids do when they wake up from a nightmare. He was awake, fully awake. I swallowed hard, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "What do you mean, buddy?" His lips barely moved, his voice dropped lower, just a whisper. "He's standing right behind you." My body locked up, my breath hitched in my throat. The room suddenly felt colder, the air pressing down on me. Every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't move. I didn't turn around. I could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes on my back, a presence that didn't belong. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just my son's imagination playing tricks on him, that if I turned around I would see nothing but shadows. But deep down I knew. Something was there, watching, waiting. And in that moment I realized something even more terrifying. My son wasn't scared. He wasn't panicking, wasn't clinging to me like a frightened child. He was just standing there, staring past me, his face void of emotion, like he had already accepted it, like he had seen it before. A cold dread settled deep in my bones. Slowly I forced myself to breathe, to swallow the fear rising in my throat. "Come here," I said, reaching out to him. "Come to me." He hesitated. Then, without a word, he stepped forward, slipping his small hand into mine. His fingers were ice cold. I pulled him onto the bed, wrapping an arm around him protectively. My eyes never left the darkness behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. Instead, I whispered, "It's okay, buddy. I'm here." He pressed his face into my shoulder. His voice was muffled, but I heard him clearly. "No, Dad, he's still here." And at that moment a shadow moved across the wall. Something was in the room with us, and it wasn't leaving. A cold shiver wrapped around me, tight and suffocating. My son's words echoed in my head. "He's still here." I wanted to tell myself it was just his imagination, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it. The air in the room had changed. It was heavier, thick with something unseen. My instincts screamed at me, "Don't turn around," but I had to. I had to prove to myself that there was nothing there, that we were alone. Taking a slow, shaky breath, I forced myself to look. The room was the same as before, dimly lit, silent. The furniture stood still, untouched. But something felt wrong. And then I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't mine. It wasn't my son's. It moved across the wall, stretching unnaturally, shifting as if it had a mind of its own. My breath caught in my throat. The shape flickered, distorted, before vanishing as if it had never been there. But I had seen it. My son had seen it. I turned back to him. His wide eyes met mine, filled with something no child should ever feel. Acceptance. Like he knew this presence. Like it wasn't the first time he had seen it. "Come on, buddy," I said, my voice barely steady. "Let's check your room." I needed to be the adult. I needed to prove there was nothing there, even if I didn't believe it myself. Holding his cold little hand, I led him out of my room. The hallway was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the nightlight plugged into the wall. The shadows stretched longer than they should have, as if reaching for us. My son's room was just a few steps away, but every inch felt like a mile. With every step, my pulse pounded harder, my body tense, my breath shallow. I reached for the doorknob. It was ice cold. Swallowing my fear, I turned it slowly and pushed the door open. The dim glow of the nightlight spilled into the room, casting soft illumination over his small bed, his toys, his dresser. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. I stepped inside, my son clinging to my arm. My eyes scanned every corner. The closet door was slightly open. A sliver of darkness peeked through. I hesitated. My son pointed at the closet. His hand trembled. There. A sharp chill spread through me, sinking into my bones. I didn't want to look, but I had to. With a deep breath, I reached for the closet door. My fingers barely brushed the handle when, thump, something inside the closet shifted. I froze. My son's grip on my arm tightened. He let out a shaky breath, but he didn't scream. He didn't cry. I pulled the door open. Nothing. Just clothes, shoes, boxes stacked neatly in the corner, but the air inside now was wrong. It was too cold. Like the closet didn't belong to this house. I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. "See? No one's here, buddy, just your imagination." But my son didn't look relieved. He wasn't even looking at the closet anymore. His eyes were locked on something behind me. A heavy silence filled the room. My pulse hammered. Slowly I turned my head. The mirror. My son's reflection stood there, just as it should. But something was off. It took me a moment to realize his reflection wasn't moving. He was standing next to me, holding my arm, breathing. But in the mirror, he was perfectly still, unblinking, expressionless. And then the reflection of my son smiled, but the real one didn't. A jolt of terror shot through me. I grabbed my son, pulling him away from the mirror, from the closet, from whatever was in this room. "We're sleeping in my room tonight," I said, my voice firm, my hands trembling. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. As we stepped into the hallway, I turned off the light. The room went dark, but just before I closed the door, I saw it. A figure standing in the mirror, watching us leave, and smiling. I shut the door behind us, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. My son clung to my arm, his tiny fingers gripping my shirt as if letting go would pull him into something unseen. I didn't blame him. I felt it too. The house had changed. The air was heavier, suffocating. Every shadow stretched unnaturally. as if the darkness itself was alive, moving, watching. I kept my grip on my son as we walked down the hallway. The dim glow from the nightlight flickered, casting strange shapes along the walls. I knew I was imagining it, I had to be, but every shape, every curve of the shadows looked like figures standing still, waiting. By the time we reached my bedroom, my skin was damp with sweat. I locked the door behind us, not that I knew what good it would do. Whatever was in this house didn't need doors. My son crawled onto my bed and wrapped himself in the blanket, his body small, fragile. I sat beside him, my mind racing. What had I seen? A trick of the light? A dream I hadn't fully woken up from? Or was it something worse? The security cameras. The thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. I had installed cameras in the house months ago, mostly for safety. I had never needed them until now. Reaching for my phone, I opened the security app. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the recorded footage. 3:12 a.m. The exact time my son had woken me up. I pressed play. The screen showed the hallway outside his room. At first, everything looked normal. The soft night light, the closed doors, the quiet stillness of the house. Then, static. For 3 seconds, the camera flickered, distorting, breaking apart into jagged lines. When the image cleared, I felt my stomach drop. There, standing outside my son's door, was a figure, tall, unmoving, a shadow darker than the darkness around it. No features, no face, just a shape. Watching. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. My son sat beside me, watching the screen, his small body pressed close to mine. I didn't know if he understood what he was seeing. Then the figure moved, not like a person, not like something with bones and muscles. It glided. 1 second it was standing still, the next it was closer. I scrubbed the footage back and forth, trying to make sense of it, but it made no sense. No footsteps, no sound, just there. And then closer. A breath shuddered out of me. "Dad," my son whispered. I turned to him. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted. He was staring, not at the phone, at the closet. My blood ran cold. I followed his gaze. The closet door, which I had closed, was now slightly open. I hadn't heard it move. I hadn't felt a breeze. But there it was. Ajar, just enough for something to peek through. And then I did hear something. A whisper. Software almost playful. Right behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell off the bed. But there was nothing there. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I grabbed my son and pulled him closer. My mind was racing. This wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't my imagination. Something was here, and it wanted us to know it. "Go to sleep, buddy," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't argue. He curled into my side, pulling the blanket up to his chin. His breathing was slow, controlled, but I knew he wasn't sleeping, neither was I. I kept my eyes open, listening. The whispering stopped. But I knew. It was still here, watching, waiting. And whatever it wanted, it wasn't done yet. Sleep was impossible. My son lay curled against me, his breath slow and steady, but I knew he wasn't really asleep. Neither was I. How could I be? Something was in the house. Something had been watching, and worst of all, I didn't know what it wanted. Every nerve in my body was on high alert. The silence felt louder than any sound. The shadows in the corners of my room felt darker than before, stretching, shifting like they were waiting for me to look away. I didn't dare move, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I had to understand what was happening. I had to know why. Digging into the past morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the first slivers of sunlight streamed through the curtains, I pulled my phone from the nightstand. My hands were stiff from gripping the blanket all night, my body exhausted, but I didn't care. I opened the security app again, going back to the footage, the shadow outside my son's room, the way it moved, too fast, too unnatural. Then the whisper, the open closet. My skin crawled just thinking about it. I needed to go deeper. I searched online for the history of my house. Maybe there was an explanation, maybe, hopefully, there was a logical reason for all of this. But what I found made my blood turn to ice. Years ago, before we had moved in, the house had belonged to a man named Thomas Graves, a single father, just like me. And one night his son had woken up screaming. He had told his father the same thing my son told me. "There's someone in my room." Thomas hadn't believed him. He told his son it was just a nightmare, just his imagination. He had tucked him back into bed and told him to sleep. The next morning, his son was gone. No forced entry, no sign of struggle, no footprints leading out of the house, just gone. Thomas swore he had nothing to do with it. The police investigated for years, but no answers ever came. The case remained unsolved, and now, all these years later, my son had woken up saying the exact same thing. A shiver ran through me. This wasn't just a coincidence. Something was here, and I had ignored it for too long. Facing the truth, I turned to my son, who was still lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. "Hey, buddy," I said gently. "I need you to tell me the truth, okay?" His small eyes met mine. "Okay." I took a deep breath. "The man in your room, have you seen him before?" He hesitated, then slowly he nodded. My stomach dropped. "How long?" I whispered. His voice was barely audible. "A long time." The air left my lungs. My hands went cold. He had never told me. He had never said anything, and I had never noticed. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely steady. His little hands clenched the blanket. "Because he told me not to." I swallowed hard. "Buddy, what does he want?" He hesitated again, his lips parted, and then, in the softest whisper, he said, "He wants me to go with him." A cold rush of fear slammed into me like a wave. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Number. I wasn't going to let that happen. I pulled him into my arms, holding him tighter than ever before. I didn't care what this thing was. I didn't care what it wanted. It wasn't taking my son. The final decision, I had spent the night in fear, unsure of what to do. But now, I knew. We had to leave. Now I wasn't going to make the same mistake Thomas Graves had made. I wasn't going to ignore the signs, brush it off as a dream. This was real. And I wasn't waiting around to see what happened next. I grabbed my son's backpack and started stuffing his clothes into it. My own hands were shaking as I packed our things. I didn't know where we would go. A hotel, maybe? Anywhere but here. I turned to my son. "We're leaving, okay? Right now." He didn't ask why. He just nodded. As we walked to the front door, I felt it. That presence. Watching, waiting. I didn't turn around. I didn't look at the mirrors, the closets, the shadows. I just grabbed my son's hand and walked out. And as the door closed behind us, I swear I heard it. A whisper. He was mine. But not anymore. The moment we stepped out of the house, I felt like I could breathe again. The air outside was crisp, fresh, real. It didn't feel heavy, suffocating, or filled with an unseen presence pressing against my skin. But even as I stood there, gripping my son's cold hand, something in my gut told me this wasn't over. We got in the car, and my fingers fumbled as I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, but my hands were still shaking. My son sat silently in the passenger seat, hugging his backpack close. He didn't ask where we were going, because he knew anywhere but here. I pulled out of the driveway, my eyes flicking up to the rearview mirror. The house stood behind us, dark and still, like a predator watching its prey leave. And then, a shadow moved in the window. My stomach twisted. My breath hitched. I looked at my son. His eyes were locked on the same window. He saw it too. I pressed the gas harder. The house shrank behind us as we sped down the street. The sun had fully risen now, casting golden light over the neighbourhood. Everything looked so normal. It almost made me feel crazy, almost. But I knew better. I had seen it. And worse, it had seen us. Something follows. We checked into a small motel on the edge of town, a place with flickering neon signs and scratchy bedsheets. It didn't matter. We just needed to be anywhere but home. I locked the door behind us, double-checking the bolt. My son sat on the bed, hugging his knees to his chest. For the first time in hours, I exhaled. "We're safe now," I said, forcing a smile. "Okay, buddy?" He didn't answer. I knelt beside him. "Hey, you don't have to be scared anymore. We're far away from that place." Slowly he turned his head. His lips parted. And then, in a quiet, trembling voice, he said, "Dad, he's here." The room turned ice cold. Every muscle in my body locked up. "No, buddy," I whispered. "We left him. He's back at the house." My son shook his head, his small hands gripping the blanket. His voice came out weaker this time. "He followed us." The air in the motel felt wrong, just like it had back home. My pulse pounded as I turned toward the bathroom mirror. At first I saw nothing but our reflections. Then the light above us flickered, and for the briefest moment, so fast I almost thought I imagined it, there was a third reflection, tall, shadowed, standing right behind us, watching, waiting. I lunged forward, grabbing my son and pulling him away from the mirror. My chest heaved as I backed us against the far wall. This wasn't possible. We had left. We had escaped. Hadn't we? The final choice. I didn't know what this thing was. A ghost? A demon? A curse? All I knew was one thing. It wanted my son. And I wasn't going to let it take him. I had made a mistake before. I had ignored the signs, brushed off the warnings. Not this time. I grabbed my son's face gently, looking straight into his wide, terrified eyes. "We are going to end this," I told him, "right now." His lips trembled. "How?" I didn't know, but I had one idea. I pulled out my phone, scrolling back to the house's history. Thomas Graves, the man who lost his son, the man who had lived through this before me. He had vanished years after his son did. No one ever found him. But his last recorded words, they sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't the house, it was him, and he will never stop. My blood ran cold. This thing, it didn't live in the house. It latched onto its victims. It followed them, no matter where they went. My hands shook as I put my phone down. I had been wrong. Leaving wouldn't save us. This thing wasn't tied to the house. It was tied to my son. The whisper that ended everything. A deep, hollow dread filled my chest. My son looked up at me, eyes wide, desperate. He was waiting for me to tell him it was going to be okay, but I couldn't lie to him, because as I sat there, holding him close, I felt it again. That cold presence, right behind me, closer than before. A whisper, soft and slow, tickled my ear. "You can't run." The lights flickered, the air turned to ice, and for the first time, I understood. This wasn't over. It would never be over. Not until it got what it wanted. Not until it took him. Fade to black. What do you think was really happening? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to watch till the end for more chilling stories.